Parents, the following program is intended for people over the age of 13. If your kids are younger than that, please use the YouTube Kids app. Peter Bernard's Scary Stories for Adults.
It's the Scary Stories NYC 2019 Christmas Special. I'm your host, Henry Lee Dogman. In this episode, we've got your old pal Bigfoot dropping by to tell you some very frightening, holiday-themed Dogman stories. And from what I've heard, supposedly, PQ Ribber and Dr. Death will be here to...
My green, dead ears are burning. That means a mortal is talking about me.
Dr. Death, welcome to the show. I heard you have a Christmas Dogman story to tell us.
That's very correct. We have an excellent Dogman story coming up. In fact, we have the best Dogman story coming up. It's about Christmas, but it's good anyway.
Awesome. Do you want to lead off the show?
Well, I'd rather save it till the end, save the best for last, as they say. You tell your little Dogman holiday tales, and then, when you've all done your best, I'm going to bring out PQ Ribber himself, and I'm going to top each and every one of you.
That's okay, I understand. I'll start us off instead then with this all-new Dogman story. We've told plenty of Christmas and Thanksgiving-related Dogman tales over the years, but nobody has ever submitted us a Hanukkah-related encounter with an upright walking canid. Until now, that is. Get your dreidel and your potato latkes ready, because we're about to jump into our first ever Yuletide Dogman story, told from the perspective of those who celebrate the Festival of Lights. And that story is called The Hannukah Hellhound. Dear Scary Stories NYC, hello from a fellow New York City native and resident. I think I have something you would want, something you've never had on your show before. A Hanukkah Dogman story. This is the tale of one of the only times I've ever gone out into the wilderness outside the city, and it's also the main reason I'm scared to ever leave again. This is the story of the Hanukkah that I and my family saw an actual werewolf-type Dogman. For those of you not in the know, Hanukkah is a holiday that goes back over 2,000 years. It's mutated in form and celebration more than once, and to this day, it means different things to different people, even within Judaism. Maybe I should say, especially. Originally, Hanukkah was a celebration of a military victory of one tribe of people over another. After the Middle East was conquered by the Romans, however, the military aspect of the celebration was severely downplayed. It was during that point in history that Hanukkah became mainly a celebration of what was considered a miracle, that light burned for 8 days when there had only been fuel for 1 day. It's become a celebration of the unlikely survival and victory of underdogs, and also an excuse to eat potato latkes. I like mine smothered in applesauce. My parents told me that when they were growing up, my grandparents on both sides of the family were extremely old school. As a consequence, they only got a little bit of gelt, which means money, each of the 8 nights of the festival, a little bit more each night. Then, at the end, they were expected to donate 10% to charity. It was some sort of civics lesson, I guess, coupled with a math test. They both grew up swearing that if they had kids, they would give them gifts like they wished they could have gotten at Hanukkah time when they were young. They still would give us gelt, but in the form of candy gelt, like chocolate shaped into a coin wrapped in a metallic cover. We would get a gift per night for the 8 nights, increasing in value each day. The first couple of days would be stuff from the dime store, which was the equivalent in those days of the modern dollar or 99-cent store. Some nights, the gift would be something like underwear or new socks, which were kind of anticlimactic things to have waited all day to open. My parents always made up for it, though, on the 8th night, which was our equivalent of Christmas morning. We would get usually 80% of what we had asked for in terms of that year's must-have toy items, or musical albums, or whatever we were into through our various stages of growing up. Some of the presents would have wrapping paper with dreidels or menorahs drawn on them, but there would be ones with Santa and Christmas trees or whatever on them too. We weren't the only Jewish family in our neighborhood, or even on our block, but Dad was very conscious about making sure we didn't get any fewer things than any of our neighbors who celebrated Christmas. He wanted us to be proud of who we were and what was unique about ourselves, but he also wanted desperately for us to fit in with others around us and be accepted as normal and similar by our neighbors. So, one year, the family next door went away for the Christmas break. We didn't really find out where they went until they got back, or at least I didn't. It turns out that their old man had rented a cabin in the woods for the family to spend the Christmas holiday at. It sounded nice, like a Bing Crosby TV special come to life. The cabin had a fir tree right outside one of the windows, so rather than chopping down a Christmas tree, they just strung lights out onto the fir and watched it flash and blink from inside by the warm fire. I loved the sound of it, and I made the mistake of talking about it over dinner that night when my dad was listening. Of course, my father mistook my enthusiasm for jealousy. I thought it was cool because the Christmas tree got to live. I could relate to their experience without actually wanting to go and do the same thing myself. We didn't even ever have a Christmas tree at all. We had a menorah, and my siblings and I were quite fine with that. So, the next thing I knew, before January had even officially arrived, Dad had already put down the rent money to reserve us 2 weeks in a cabin out in the middle of a forest somewhere in Pennsylvania. He did this a full year in advance, so I spent that year feeling guilty that I had inflicted this on everybody and dreading the eventual arrival of my usual favorite time of year, Hanukkah. This action by Dad, in all of our opinions, was taking the keeping up with the Joneses stuff a little too far. None of us knew anything about the country. We were all city dwellers going back to our patriarch and matriarch who came over from Eastern Europe in the 1920s. Except for a few black sheep, none of us had ever strayed from Manhattan farther than Queens or Yonkers in all that time. None of us had ever known any kind of life except that which occurs on pavement and concrete. In addition, all our Hanukkah traditions involved us being home. None of us really wanted to go through with all the effort of packing and traveling to go away from where we looked forward to being all year long, at home, goofing off, celebrating Hanukkah. We knew, however, that we had no say in the matter. Dad had already reserved the place before we even knew he was thinking about it. This was a status symbol to him. He had bragged all year long about it to people he worked with and all the neighbors. Backing away from spending Hanukkah in the country for Dad would have meant a huge loss of face. In his mind, I mean. I'm not sure anybody else really cared. Even Mom was against the idea, but even Mom packed, and we all got ready to go. Dad drove us all to the old age home to pick up Grandpa. He was very happy about getting to spend the holidays with us at our place, as we hadn't invited him for the last few years. When he realized we were driving away from the city to some cabin in the middle of nowhere, he started ranting and raving in Yiddish to my mother. I didn't know what he was saying, but I knew it wasn't good, and I knew it was about my dad. The cabin was at the end of a whole lot of highway driving, then local driving, on roads that hadn't been cleared after the last snow. It was a lot of bouncing up and down, as I recall. We missed our dirt road turnoff 3 times before figuring it out and discovered it was another 10 or 15 minute drive down that 1-lane snow-covered dirt road surrounded tightly on both sides by tall trees before the cabin appeared. After that trip, we were glad to be there, and it was a nice little place, but we remember it with horror. If you can imagine a less run-down version of the cabin from the Evil Dead movies, and imagine it covered in snow in the dusk and seeming sort of quaint, then you're imagining the place my dad had rented for us. So, for that era, we thought it was fairly modern. There was electricity installed and there was an indoor bathroom, so we felt that we were in heaven. The only way to cook things was if we built a fire in the fireplace, and that was also the only way to get warm as well. Actually, Dad found space heaters that worked in the basement on the second day, but that first night, my dad's first priority was to get a fire started in the fireplace while being shouted at in Yiddish by his wife's dad. That night, we all froze under our covers and had a hard time getting very much sleep. I think I slept more than the rest, so I was in a better mood the second day than anybody else. Over breakfast, my youngest brother kept talking about seeing a wolf man outside his window. I was sleeping in his room, so that meant he saw it outside my window as well. Let's call him Jerry, which is not his real name. Nobody believed Jerry. They all still thought he was a little kid. I must have spent more time with him than the others because I knew Jerry did not make stuff up. If anything, he was over-literal about things. He was the most specific person I've ever known. Now that he's old like me, he's known for these very qualities I'm trying to describe. Back then, though, he was still regarded as a little kid, and little kids sometimes let their imaginations get out of control, at least according to the worldview of my family. People cheered up a bit after Dad discovered the space heaters, and we all watched Pennsylvania local broadcast antenna television, which I think had 2 channels that came in all right, and 1 or 2 that were extremely fuzzy. We pretty much gave up almost right away and just left it on one of the channels randomly. Everyone was bored, cold, and sad, wishing we could be home. As the sun went down and it started to get dark outside, I saw Jerry begin to become increasingly agitated. He wouldn't be scared and fidgeting if he had imagined the Wolfman the night before. He was old enough and smart enough to understand the difference between imagination and reality. I started to become as worried as he was. Rather than watching the boring television, our eyes were darting around, looking out the cabin windows, watching carefully to see if there was anything out there that shouldn't be. Jerry said a prayer before dinner asking God to protect his family from the Wolfman that night, and Dad yelled at him. Then, Grandpa started ranting loudly in Yiddish again and a full intra-family argument began. I ducked under all of them and got myself more potato latkes. I'm not one for arguing. When I'm stressed out, I just overeat. So, that night, Jerry and I had a lot of trouble sleeping because of what had happened the night before. I suggested to him that the Wolfman wasn't really a danger to us unless he came inside the house. As long as he stayed outside, it didn't really matter if he was there or not. That sort of made sense to Jerry, so I went on. Why don't we just make certain all the windows in our room are locked, then close the curtains on each of them so we can't see out. Then if the Dogman's there, we won't have to know, and we can get a good night of sleep. Jerry was so tired, he said he'd agree to the deal on one condition. I asked him what the condition was, and it turned out he wanted me to help push his bed out into the middle of the room. He didn't want to be close enough to the window that the Wolfman could reach in and grab him. So, after we had rearranged the furniture, locked the windows, and drawn the curtains all closed, we settled in for what we hoped would be a restful second night of Hanukkah. A very loud howling woke us both up. I thought it sounded like a sad or wounded dog, but Jerry whispered to me, "That was the Wolfman." We both, as quietly as we could, snuck over to the window closest to the noise and pulled the curtain ever so slightly to the side so that we could peek out. Now, I had been expecting to either see a dog, a wolf, or the Wolfman from the movies. This was none of those things. This was like an animal mixed with a monster. I had never seen anything like this before. It looked as if a kangaroo became a serial killer or something. It didn't have legs like a kangaroo, but it stood up like one and had a similar kind of brown fur all over. This was not a guy who changed into a wolfman and was still wearing his slacks like in the movies. This was some kind of upright walking, dog-headed animal. It was looking down toward its feet as though it were looking for something on the ground. It would take a few steps forward every so often, moving around on the spot. I have no idea what it was looking down at or what it was doing at all. I only registered that it seemed to be man-sized and its legs were bent backward. I was a bad judge of size and distance back then, especially out of the context of the city. I decided to get a second opinion. I made the shush sign, putting my pointer finger over my mouth. I got my brother's eye contact and he understood. Then I motioned for us to go to Mom and Dad's room. Fortunately, they were both up reading and the door was open. We tiptoed in an exaggerated way to stress our point, and when we got their attention, we both made the silent sign with our fingers over our lips. Mom chuckled, Dad grunted, and made sounds to demonstrate his annoyance. We made a sign for our mom to follow us, and my father told her to ignore us. She countered that if she can't even humor her children over Hanukkah, then what joy exactly was she still allowed to enjoy in life? Dad couldn't respond to that, so Mom got out of bed and followed us, walking on her tiptoes and trying to be quiet. I saw the smile on her face, and I don't know what she expected to see when she peeked out our window with us. Maybe she thought we had seen a deer and wanted to know if we were at the North Pole or something innocent like that. Something childlike, you know. What she got instead was an eyeful that she later described as a 6-foot-tall feral dog that walked upright like a man. And by later, I mean years later, many years. That night, she got so shocked that she started making these nonsensical noises. Jerry started telling the story of Mom seeing the werewolf beginning the next Hanukkah, which we spent at home where we wanted to be. In Jerry's version, which was basically true, she started off by making this sound sort of like rut or root. Then she backed dramatically away from the window, which he would pantomime as though he were in a silent movie, and she would shout this long multisyllabic word that was sort of like ba-ba-yout, tu-tu-balayaman, and she ran out of the room. Jerry and I looked out the window again, and we saw that the Dogman had heard Mom's scream. It was staring at the window with yellow glowing eyes. "Oh no," said Jerry. Eyeing us with great interest, the wolf-like man or man-like wolf took a step in our direction. We screamed and ran off to our grandpa's room. I don't really remember why. Maybe Mom and Dad were arguing. The way I remember it, nothing else of note happened that night. Or if it did, we couldn't hear it from Grandpa's room. In the morning, we packed up and left silently before breakfast, with nobody having to ask or explain why. We were utterly silent until we passed a sign for a diner, and we all started begging for breakfast. We were home in time to light the candle that night, and we spent the rest of Hanukkah there at home where we wanted to be. We were so happy to be back. Grandpa hardly spoke Yiddish at Dad once the entire rest of the holiday season. So we had a happy ending, but it got a little hairy for a while there, thanks to the Dogman. I want to thank you for letting me tell my family's story, and I hope everyone watching your show has an excellent holiday season, no matter what they may choose to celebrate at this time of year. We wish a happy 2020 to each and every one of you. The end. Well, what did you think of that?
Yeah, that was pretty scary.
I know, right?
Not as scary as my Dogman Christmas story, which is still to come
Huh?
later in this very program.
Okay, but right now, your old pal Bigfoot has a scary Christmas Dogman story for you. Take it away, Bigfoot. I love this time of year when it starts to get snowy. One of my favorite winter activities is to leave lots of Bigfoot tracks in the snow, then suddenly have them just end in the middle of a field. That really confuses the humans. They still haven't figured out how I do that. What do you guys do to fool the humans in wintertime? Please let me know in the comments. Henry Lee Dogman sent a message. He says he's heading back toward human territory, and once he's in Wi-Fi range, he will be sending us some new, scary Dogman stories. So that's something to look forward to. In the meantime, you have me, and I've got some scary Dogman tales with me. Our next two stories both took place in December before Christmas. One happened in Wisconsin, and almost certainly stars what we might call the Wisconsin werewolf, a type of Dogman cryptid probably first written about by Linda Godfrey in her book The Beast of Bray Road. That story happens in a location you wouldn't normally associate with Dogman, i.e. the suburbs. This first story, however, takes place in an even less likely spot than that, which is why we're calling this one Cross County Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a Dogman story for you that took place in December in the final year of my mother's life. She was ill, and the doctors told us she might not last until Christmas. She decided she would rather come home to spend her final weeks with her pets and the family. None of us could have expected that her decision would catapult me face to face with the legendary Dogman. This is not one of your Dogman stories that took place in the woods. This one happened in Yonkers, of all places, and in a pretty busy part of it as well. I'm talking about the Cross County Shopping Center. For those of you not from the New York area, Cross County was the first big outdoor shopping mall of its type to open around here. I think it opened in the 1950s because I remember my mother talking about what a big deal it was when it first came around. We had a Christmas tradition related to that mall, and in fact, the tradition is the other reason I had a sighting of the Michigan Dogman in New York. My father passed when I was 19 and my sister was 2 years younger. That was the year Mom started the tradition of taking us to this restaurant that was in the Cross County Shopping Center. We'd go shopping, usually for boring stuff like underwear, but then it would end up with us getting to eat out. Sometimes during the year we might go to a Chinese food restaurant, but Christmas was the only time we got to go out for steak. My apologies to you vegans. This was the 20th century, and everyone I knew liked steak above all other kinds of dinner. In fact, I still think vegetarianism is a secret plot against mankind, but that subject would be better saved for a different kind of video. So, my mother was always a bit weird with the way she would park her car in any parking lot. Going to Cross County was a case in point. She would park in this spot that was way as far away from the stores as possible, so we would have to waste all this extra time walking to and from the place. It just seemed crazy to me. To Mom, though, it all made sense because she was paranoid about the car getting dinged by other cars. So she would only park in a spot far from everyone else, and it had to be blocked off on two sides, thereby cutting down the number of angles it could accidentally be dinged from. Her favorite spot was all the way up on the north side of the parking lot. It was the corner spot, and it was really far from the stores. It was across the exitway from the restaurant, though, so there was that. I'm reminded of how careful she was about parking, yet She would just walk out in traffic and almost get us all run down crossing the road to the restaurant. Cars, we must be careful with. Ourselves? That was my mom in her prime. So when we knew this would be Mom's last December, my sister and I decided we should get a steak dinner from that restaurant and bring it home so we could have our family tradition one last time. We knew Mom was only going to eat a bite or two, but even the smell of it we thought might bring a little joy to her. We split up duties and it ended up falling to me to go get the food. I parked in Mom's favorite spot, crossed the busy exitway, and while sitting in the establishment waiting for the order to be prepared, an old friend of mine who I hadn't seen in years happened in with his new wife. I knew they had been dating but was surprised they had married, and we fell into a discussion of how they did it on an impulse in Las Vegas. It was really awesome to forget my troubles and my family's sadness and to hear happy stories, so I got distracted. When their table was called and my food came, we exchanged new contact information and said goodnight. I walked through traffic in a blissed-out state back to the car, then realized I had left my wallet with my car keys back in the restaurant. I dropped the food on the roof of my 1987 Chrysler New Yorker and ran back through traffic to the restaurant. Fortunately, one of the people working there had already spotted my stuff, and he was just coming out the front door to call me back as I arrived there. We both laughed, and I took back my property, relieved and grateful that there are still some good people in the world. While I was thanking the guy, I noticed he was looking past me, and his expression turned into something I couldn't translate. I turned around to see what he was staring at, and I got the shock of my life. Heck, that was the shock of at least 3 or 4 lifetimes. There, on the roof of my Chrysler, was what looked like some kind of a man in a monster suit. Only it wasn't a monster like Frankenstein, it was an animal costume of some sort. My first thought was that it was a dog costume, but dogs don't stand up. It was very man-like, not like an ape or like a bear, but it seemed to have a real, live tail attached, and its mouth and ears moved the way a dog's or a wolf's do. The eyes shone and glowed as you looked at them, but did not seem like glass eyes or whatever. They seemed real. Everything about it seemed more real than any monster costume I had ever seen in the movies. I have to admit, though, I really was not a huge fan of those kind of films when this sighting occurred. I started watching werewolf and Bigfoot shows and movies after this sighting, though. I became very interested to see what could be done with special effects makeup after that night, because I wanted to understand what I had really seen. As much as I hate to admit it, I don't think the technology existed then to create a live performance in a parking lot of a werewolf creature eating takeout steak dinners, because that's what this guy was doing. He was devouring the food and parts of the packaging as well. I was furious, and I ran toward the car shouting foul language the entire way. I was ready to pummel this guy, as you can imagine. Well, I'm lucky I'm a slow runner, or that the guy at the restaurant was faster than me, because he caught up to me and grabbed me from behind in a man hug, and he told me to slow down and look at what I was running toward. The dog-headed, hairy man thing was standing on the roof of my car, ripping and tearing all the food apart with claws and fangs. He was covered in our Christmas dinner, and then, all of a sudden, he noticed the two of us. He turned quickly to glare in our direction, and all of a sudden I wished I could be anywhere but there. Was he gonna run at us? If so, he would definitely catch up to me before I was able to get back inside the restaurant. I started to feel more than a little panicked, and I wasn't sure what to do. Someone driving out of Cross County beeped loudly at the Dogman, and it took off running behind some trees that were over there. I couldn't see it anymore once it went behind a tree, but there wasn't any place for it to hide over there. I'm not sure where it could have come from, and I certainly couldn't see clearly where it had gone to. The parking lot is not by any forest. It's just by the cross-county parkway. It isn't a place where a large carnivore could live, you wouldn't think. The restaurant had already heard the story of my mother, and they were kind enough to make me the same dinner all over again at no additional cost. Talk about a Christmas miracle. When I finally got the food home, my mother was very appreciative, but I have to say, she liked the Dogman story better than the food. You want to know why? Because she wanted to know if the Dogman had dinged up my car. That was the last time I saw my mother really enjoy herself, and for me those memories will forever be inextricably linked to the time I saw the Cross County Dogman. Holly Jolly Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a Dogman story that took place in the suburbs around Christmas. It's kind of a weird story, but it scares me every time I tell it. My parents decided to move to Miami Beach in the mid-1980s and asked me if I wanted their house or if they should sell it. I was still youngish and sort of a hipster back then, so I really didn't know if I was ready to move out of the city to the suburbs yet. I ended up taking the place, as it had been where I grew up, and I loved the idea of finally being in charge of the house. I wonder if I would have taken the place so readily if I had known it would lead to a terrifying encounter with the Dogman. My first Christmas as homeowner, I wanted to put up Christmas decorations as my parents had always done. Or I should say, I wanted to do it differently from how my parents had always done it. This was the 1980s, so I wanted to move past the multicolored lights and plastic decorations into the direction of all white lights and decorations incorporating wreaths and real holly, nothing plastic. I had driven past a store in West Allis that had the kind of stuff I was looking for, so when I was ready to do the decorating thing, I drove down there and stocked up on modern, 1980s kinds of Christmas decorations. No more Rudolph with a blinking nose. I was gonna go classy, at least in my opinion at that time. As I was on my way home, it had already gotten dark, and I remember I was on South 116th Street when I saw it. That's a street that's tree-lined on one side, but has houses on the other. The tree-lined side has a park and a golf course, but since I don't remember ever being inside either, I can't really remember which block exactly this took place on. It was either by the park or the golf course, though. What happened was, someone jumped out in the road, blocking me, so I had to slow down. At first I felt a jolt of fear shoot through me, thinking this was about to be a gang attack on my car. I looked around, but I still couldn't see any other figures besides this guy. Where could the rest of them be hiding? I double-checked that all my doors were locked, then looked back at the silhouette in the road, who was now beginning to be illuminated by my headlights. It wasn't a man. It was some kind of a monkey with a dog head, a really tall one, too. I knew the zoo was not far from there, and my initial reaction was that this was an escaped animal from a zoo. I figured it was an exotic creature with a dog-like head that I had just never heard of before. Maybe a kind of marsupial. Its head was not unlike a kangaroo's head, but the thing wasn't brown or tan. It was very dark. Another thing is that it was shaggy like a dog. The fur did not resemble that of a kangaroo at all. It was long, dark, and sort of wavy or curly fur or hair. The eyes hurt to look at. They were bright and felt like laser pointers burning into me when I viewed them directly. My eyes hurt so much that I had to close them and rub them. When I opened them again, I was seeing stars for a while. As my vision began to clear, I realized I did not know where the dog-headed monkey man was any longer. I turned around and looked in every direction, panicked. Was it gone? Was it behind me? To the side? Which side? At the time, I felt so scared that it was beyond any sense of fright I had ever experienced. Maybe this was true panic. It was the most frightening moment of my life because I didn't know what the rules of this game were. There isn't supposed to be an animal that can make your eyes hurt and burn just by looking at you. And had it run off? Was it hiding? Or had it just disappeared? In that moment, I wasn't just scared because I had seen something very large and feral looking. I was scared because nothing that was happening was making sense. It was that fear you get in a nightmare when you realize things are even worse than they had seemed. You thought there was a man blocking your path, but it turned out to be some inexplicable beast that could do things that nothing in nature was supposed to be able to do. The next thing that happened may have actually cracked my brain like a Christmas nut for a little while. This was the most terrifying thing that ever happened to me. It was the worst fright of my life, and it almost killed me. You can laugh if you want, but try to imagine being in my place when all of a sudden, upside down, you saw the face of some kind of intelligent demon dog coming down from the top of your windshield to look right at you. It was on my roof. While my eyes had been shut, the thing had jumped to the roof of my car and I never even sensed it. How graceful and light-footed must the creature have been? It was larger than the largest man, yet I didn't feel the car bounce when he climbed on top. I lost control of several body functions that are normally pretty automatically controlled, and I screamed like a madman. I guess I basically was a madman by that point. I jammed my foot on the gas pedal and the Dogman was pulled backward as the car jerked forward. I heard and felt him rolling off the back of the car as I drove away. He wasn't so graceful in his exit as he had been in his entrance. I screamed the entire drive home. I remember stopping for a red light and screaming. I was still screaming when I got home, and I sat in the car, trying to get it out of my system so I could get out of that car and go into my house without having a heart attack or without shouting at one of the neighbors. Needless to say, I was a mess. I put up the Christmas lights I had bought and the decorations, bit by bit, over the next few days and weeks. I didn't feel the joy in doing it, but I kept pressing onward anyway. I was still kind of in a state of shock from the Dogman experience. Once I got the white lights up, I found them painful to look at. I think it was psychosomatic, but when I would gaze in their direction, my eyes would burn, just like that night when I looked into the eyes of the Dogman monster. I looked around at all the real holly and pine cones and so forth that I had spent so much money and time on, and for some reason, it all felt a little hollow and empty. Stylish, but hollow and empty. I ended up going to Miami for Christmas to see my parents that year. I guess, for some reason, I just wanted to get as far away as I could from the holly jolly Dogman. Today we have a really good news story, at least I think it's really good. This one entertained me, so I hope I do a good enough reading that it entertains you as well. Without any further ado, let's jump right into it, and the story is called The 2014 Snowstorm Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a wintertime Dogman story for you. It's a story I almost didn't survive to share, as it happened inside what might have been the worst snowstorm to ever hit Georgia or the American Southeast. I almost froze to death in that snow, and the only thing that kept me going was the Dogman snapping at my heels. Let me start at the beginning of the story, which was actually in Florida, not Georgia. It was February in 2014, and I had attended a business sales meeting for the company I worked for down in Miami, where it was warm and nice. When it came time to go home, the forecast was for a bad snowstorm to hit Georgia. A number of the attendees got early flights out, and I was urged not to drive home to Virginia through that weather. I had learned to doubt weather forecasters, though, as they seemed to always be predicting storms that never materialized, or at least were never as fierce as they predicted. I thought it sounded like a nice and peaceful drive home, watching the snow fall silently and having the roads largely to myself. Well, by the time I was driving north through Georgia, I sure had the roads to myself all right. There were abandoned cars here and there, but no working ones. It looked like the world had ended. There were no people anywhere, just remnants of what looked like a defeated and crushed former human civilization. The radio was telling me that all flights from local airports were canceled until further notice. Literally thousands of flights called off. I realized I had bet on the wrong horse, that I was in deep poo-poo. Giving up a little too late can sometimes be a problem for me. I get stuck in my ways sometimes, and I adapt too slowly. I guess it took this snowstorm to get me to realize that. It wasn't the first time I had miscalculated in this way, but it was the one that led to the worst inconveniences I'd ever brought down on myself. I finally decided to get off the highway and look for a local hotel at a point where the traction was so low that I literally was driving along at about 5 miles per hour. The car began overheating and conked out so fast that I didn't even have time to pull off to the side of the road once I realized what was happening. I was stalled in the right lane of the highway. I had seen a motel about 2 exits back, but that seemed like a hike that would take me 2 hours in that weather. I hoped that I might find a closer place to stay if I walked forward through the snow to the next town. Again, why did I make this decision in such an uninformed manner? I had maps in my glove compartment of the entire route from Florida to Virginia. And I possibly might have had them on my phone as well, but I don't remember that part. The GPS on my car was broken, but I had at least one other, maybe 2 other options. Yet, I still decided to just play a hunch again and walk further north. This, in spite of the fact that it was a hunch of mine which had led me into this situation in the first place. If I could go back in time and call myself an idiot, I would. But sometimes we have to almost get ourselves destroyed before we can learn a lesson, and that's the way it was with me. I trudged down the highway with the wind blowing snow into my eyes, making them burn and making it harder to see. Everything was white. I started walking for short distances with my eyes clamped shut, then opening them to regain my bearings, then closing them to walk a bit further. After about a half hour of this, I was still on the highway looking for the exit. I thought about walking back to the relative warmth of my car, but when I turned around, I literally couldn't see it any longer. It might take me even longer to walk back than it had taken me to walk to where I was. Returning to my forward movement, I eventually did find the turnoff, which was uphill and very slippery. The wind picked up, and I managed to slip and fall, completely losing my sense of direction in the process. When I had caught my breath to get up and walk again, I soon discovered I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and I was now walking through trees. I wasn't sure how I had even ended up there, as the ramp leading off the highway had seemed to be lined by snowy ground on both sides. I stopped and turned around and around and around, looking to find anything that seemed at all familiar, anything that might tell me where I had turned wrong, or where I should turn now to get it right. The more I looked, however, the more confused I became, and so I decided to give up and ask for help. I reached into my pocket and felt around for my cell phone, but it was not there. I panicked and checked every pocket, but I had a distinct memory of placing it in my right front jacket pocket, and it was not there. I thought it must have fallen out when I took that tumble back there near the off-ramp from the highway. So I turned in what I guessed would be the direction to get back there, and I began trudging along semi-blindly. I knew I was in a really bad situation, and I was beginning to grasp that every single decision I had made was only making things worse and worse. This was moving from me being delayed and inconvenienced to me entering a life-threatening situation out of which I might never climb. My heart was now beating in a somewhat panicked way, and I was beginning to grow very scared. I noticed my toes were cold and wet, and that they were in the first stages of starting to grow numb. I was beginning to fill with sadness and regret on top of the panic, and I needed something good to happen fast. That's when I saw something incredibly massive moving through the snowstorm. When I say massive, in this case, I mean man-mountain kind of massive. It was something maybe 8 feet tall, too large to be a man. It was partially in silhouette, and it was covered in snow. It was moving along in my general direction through the trees which surrounded both of us. My first impression was that it was literally an abominable snowman in the sense of an animated man made of snow walking toward me. Then, when it got maybe 40 or 50 feet away, it stopped and shook itself, not unlike the way a dog will shake rain or snow off of itself. When it did so, I could make out a very wolf-like head on top of this man-like creature. So, it was not a Yeti, and it was not a Sasquatch, but it was as tall and wide as either are reported to be. I cursed out loud. I think I was cursing the fates or something. The dog-headed man-mountain didn't seem to care for my attitude, though, and it dropped to all fours, lowering its head to my level and baring its incredibly long teeth at me. If it wanted to impress, it succeeded. I was ready to end this farce at that point. I was ready to drop to my knees like a bad football player and get ready to meet my maker, and it's possible I even might have done that literally. Parts of it get all blacked out in my memory now, as I was probably in shock, and my brain might have been getting ready to go out of business and shut down for good. The next thing I remember clearly was marching through the woods, hearing the giant beast behind me. I could hear it matching me step for step, and when I would slow down, it would growl from behind me and way up over my head. At that point, I would speed up as much as I could, but exhaustion and frostbite were going to catch up sooner or later, and there wasn't going to be anything I would be able to do to keep moving forward at that point. I was becoming loopy and emotional, feeling dizzy and sentimental. I wished I could talk to the Dogman and find out what he really was. Was he a kind of a bear? Or an ancient ground sloth? How could a dog walk upright or grow to such an enormous size? I wanted it to know I bore it no ill will, even if it decided to eat me later on to stay alive. Better for one of us to survive than neither of us, I thought. I was becoming a blithering idiot, but when everything seems about to end, you can get sentimental for what once was. So many things we take for granted in life, then, when they all get taken away, we suddenly feel such a deep sense of love for them. It's like how some people jump out of airplanes so that they can remember to appreciate how fragile life is. They put themselves in situations where they need to be completely alert in order to get through it, uninjured and alive. That's exactly where I was, and from that vantage point, even the harder times of my life seemed so comfortable in comparison. I remembered back to being forced by my parents to shovel snow. I was so bummed out by it, so resentful. I felt like they were trying to freeze me to death, and that they didn't care about me just because my toes would be cold by the time I got back inside. At least I could feel my toes back then. Oh, how I wished I could shovel my parents' driveway one more time. Oh, to go back to having the problems I used to have. The worst things that had ever happened to me in my entire life seemed like a Hawaiian vacation compared to what I was trying to survive on that day. The huge Dogman growled, and I realized I had been standing still, nearly falling asleep on my feet. This wasn't going well, and it was only getting worse and worse and worse. I had run out of ideas, and I had run out of strength. I was beginning to lose my logical mind. Soon, I knew I would lose consciousness as well, and then that would be all she wrote. At least I might pass while asleep, I thought. It might be a peaceful way to go. Maybe I was lucky, I thought. Just like I didn't appreciate shoveling snow when I was young, maybe I wasn't appreciating the mercy and kindness being shown to me on that day. Maybe this was my fate, and maybe it was a sign of universal love that I would only comprehend once I was permanently out of my limited human ego. Or maybe that Dogman would have me for lunch, and maybe it would be the most excruciatingly horrible experience that a living thing could suffer through. My face was frozen, and my mind was feeling like it was beginning to get ready to congeal as well. My brain was probably turning to jello, I thought. That made me laugh, or at least it made me want to laugh. My face felt frozen, and the strength for laughter had long since gone. I turned around, ready to offer myself to the Dogman beast. I tried to talk, but words didn't come out. I blinked through the raging snow and tried to meet the eyes of the beast for one last time. While I was doing so, I caught sight of a third member of the party. There was a large black bird in a tree, and it was working hard to keep itself on that branch of that tree. The wind and snow were conspiring to knock it off, but the bird was resisting them. Why was it there? It should have left before the weather got this bad. That bird was as denatured as I was. It was just like me, which meant it was stupid. I felt my heart going out to the creature. It was my soulmate. It was the same as I was. We had lived our entire lives only to end up getting to pass on side by side. This was my brother. This was my best friend. And it didn't matter that we were only going to spend this brief moment together. Our lives were still inextricably entwined, and we were one and the same conscious entity. This is how I felt. Then, an idea popped into my frozen daiquiri of a brain. Give the Dogman the bird to eat instead of me. All the feeling of camaraderie and kinship disappeared in one moment, as I spied a sharp-looking rock on the ground and bent over to pick it up. Confusion ensued. Then I realized I had fallen over into the snow. I wanted to go to sleep, but I knew the sleep would never end if I did. So, I relocated the rock, grasped it, and slowly began the process of regaining my footing. Once I was again as bipedal as the huge Dogman, I aimed, as well as I could, toward that large ebony flying animal, and I fired that projectile as hard and as unerringly as I could toward my target. I knew that it was him or me, and if I couldn't offer the Dogman a worthy sacrifice, he would take me instead. Everything that I had ever done in my life had led up to this single moment, and I had to put all of myself into that throw. Nothing ever had mattered so much, and if I were to continue to survive, I would need to get this throw right. The stone slipped out of my frozen hand and landed a pathetic few feet in front of me. I collapsed to the ground, and I wept, or as close as I could get to weeping under the circumstances. I had failed. I had fallen in an odd way, and I was watching the Dogman now. I was kind of upside down and sideways on top of something, I didn't know what. Maybe I had broken my body on a large stone because I knew I was unable to move. All that was left of me were my eyes and my delusional, illogical remnants of consciousness. As I watched, I saw that Dogman had noticed the bird I'd been trying to give it as an offering. It reached out and grabbed it, then swallowed it, in no short order. At least, that's the way my memory tells me it happened. Seems impossible that it could have gone down that way, but the images in my mind tell me the story in just that way. Then, I watched as the Dogman walked back the way that he and I had come from, and I prayed that he would go find my cell phone and bring it back to me. That's how illogical and far gone I was at that moment. It felt so good to lay there. I decided that it wouldn't hurt anything if I just took a little nap. Maybe I would even recover some of my strength if I did that. It made more and more sense to just go to sleep, and I couldn't remember anymore why I had been trying to stay awake. So silly, to be awake and hurting all over when one could be dreaming and feeling fine. That part of me that wanted to stay awake was mocked and driven away, and soon I found myself in dreamland. My entire body ached as I woke up in a very ugly room I was entirely unfamiliar with. I tried to sit up, but that hurt even worse, so I stopped trying. Then I tried to speak, but I coughed instead and coughed again, feeling as though I were going to choke. There was a flurry of activity, and human beings were there, moving me and doing things to me that I couldn't really understand. They were terrifying me. They had their hands all over me like I was some sort of object, and I wanted to scream in horror, but I was too busy choking. There were other incidents like that one, spaced out by long dreamless sleeping periods. I was in a hospital. It took days before I was back to normal enough for the nurses and doctors to start explaining things to me. Apparently, search teams were sent out looking for people who had abandoned their vehicles on the highway. They were able to identify me from my license plates, and so they knew who they were searching for, and that I had not yet checked into any hotel or motel or hospital. I hadn't thought of that, but it made perfect sense once they explained how I was found. I had such an intense feeling of gratitude for the people who think ahead and set up agencies that can function in such a wise way to save the least wise of us, such as myself. I felt, and still feel, extremely humbled by my debt to those people. I literally would have been a goner that day, and instead, I'm fully recovered and only missed 1 week of work. They got to me before the frostbite did, and in spite of all my terrible decisions on that day, I got away with all of it. After they told me their stories of how I was saved, I started telling anyone who would listen about the Dogman who had followed behind me and kept me going through those woods on that snowy day. They would give each other weird looks and regard me as though I were insane. Only one of the nurses acted like she believed me, but she saw the story as my brain going into shutdown and hallucinating. She said that quite often people who think they are about to perish will see angels and guardians who help guide them to safety. She told me that it's just a part of ourselves that we project outward to help us feel safe in an unsafe situation. Of course, that was absurd. This was no angel. This was something closer to a devil. This was not a comforting presence. It was a giant monster that wanted to eat me. This was not something I was glad to see coming. This was something I was glad to see going. That Dogman was as real as the bird I tried to sacrifice to it. Yes, it kept me going that day, but it was just because it didn't want to waste energy fighting me. It wanted to wait until I couldn't fight back, then take me without resistance. It was no holy vision. It was a giant land carnivore, and I didn't hallucinate it. I escaped it. Nobody in my family, and none of my friends, think that I saw a real Dogman. They all agree with the doctors and nurses, even though the doctors and nurses weren't making sense. I will never change my story because it is the truth. I saw and I survived the 2014 snowstorm Dogman.
Don't go anywhere. We've got more Dogman for you. Then later in the show, PQ River and I will have the scariest Dogman Christmas story of all. But first, this. I'd like to take a moment to say that if you have a scary story you'd like to tell us here, you can write Peter at peterbernard.com, or you can call our new Scary Stories hotline number and leave it to us in the form of a voicemail message. It's easy to remember. 804-LESCARY. That's 804-LESCARY, or 804-537-2279.
Well, it's time to get to our scary Dogman story, Deb. This one took place on Thanksgiving, and we call it Thanksgiving Day Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, this is a Dogman story that my friend told me happened to him back in the 1990s in Wisconsin when he was driving home to spend Thanksgiving with his family. He likes to tell the story when he wants to remind me or others about keeping things in perspective. I've heard it 3 times already, and I think I remember it by heart now. Let's call my friend Arthur, because he sort of resembles Graham Chapman. Arthur was driving home in the dark on the night before Thanksgiving, lost in a funk and full of stress and dread. He really didn't want to see a few of his relatives for personal reasons. One would argue with him, another was jealous and competitive, and nearly all of them were constantly looking to start fights with him by saying things to hurt his feelings. He had tried arguing back, only to find they would all band together to disagree and insult him. He tried remaining peaceful, only to find that they would band together to badmouth him for being weak and too chicken to fight back. He still hadn't come up with a strategy to avoid their barrage of emotional attacks, so he was nervous and dreading the entire weekend. One year, he had brought his girlfriend with him, only to find they all took her aside to tell her embarrassing things about him and get her to break up with him. She not only dumped him, but she stayed active Facebook friends with his family while blocking him. It sounds like his relatives are emotional terrorists, and as a result, he was properly terrorized by the idea of having to see them. And then, in an instant, none of that mattered anymore. His front left tire blew out suddenly and unexpectedly, and his remaining 3 tires skidded in directions he wasn't pointing his steering wheel. He almost flew off the road to the left, then managed to pull back to the right and slide off the road in that direction, eventually coming to a stop in a cloud of dust. He told me he had to just sit there for a minute or two, letting his heart calm down. He thought for a second that he was going to wreck his car and himself, and had only barely managed to pull over safely. He was still catching his breath when, just as suddenly as the blown tire had come, there came a loud burst of thunder, followed quickly with lightning. This nearly stopped his heart again, but while the flat tire had almost sent him into shock, the loud electrical storm and realization that it was now raining hard all around him had more of a caffeine effect on him. Leaping out of the car, he went to his trunk and got ready to change tires in the rain. By the time he finally got the car up off the ground in the front left, the rain was coming down blindingly hard. He knew he should probably get back in the car and wait out the rain, since it was getting colder, not warmer. But This was a November storm, not a summer storm, and that meant it could go on for quite some time. He decided to press onward and took the old blown tire off. As he did so, he heard strange sounds he couldn't identify. He wasn't sure if he had made the sounds himself when he dropped the tire to the ground, or if it might be the sound of rain hitting something out of his view. Maybe rain filling up and spilling over somewhere. He hadn't thought it might be someone else walking around, since he wasn't really near anything or any place. The forest-lined country road was lonely, and he was the only one on it for as far as the eye could see in either direction. Rather than pausing to investigate, he began attaching his spare tire. Noises continued as he worked as quickly as he could. He sneezed and knew he was drenched. This car had a decent heater, which he hoped would be enough to dry him off and prevent a cold or fever from coming on. Having to see his family while ill seemed an even worse fate than anything else he could imagine, and he mentally re-entered his internal stress over his relations. Pitying himself and hanging his head low, my pre-defeated friend finished with the jack and put his equipment away, slamming the trunk of the car. That is when he first saw it. Without the open car trunk blocking his view, Arthur could now see that he had an audience observing him. He told me every hair on his body stood on end, and he realized there was some kind of humanoid bear with a dog head standing right there at the edge of the wood line, up on its hind legs, watching him intently. This was the third shock in a row for Arthur, so he was having a rough day, but I guess you might say he was beginning to get used to it. Rather than panic, he mentally calculated how long it would take him to run to his driver's seat door and jump inside the car, versus how long it would take that bear-like dog to drop to all fours and race him there. Arthur wasn't sure he could win, so he tried to slowly move toward the door as calmly as he could instead. After he took about 3 casual steps, making certain not to make eye contact with the monster, his plan appeared to be working. But about when Arthur had taken 4 or 5 slide steps toward his goal, the creature became curious and started walking toward him on his hind legs. At this point, I have to stop comparing it with a bear, even though I know bears can walk on their hind legs. This, according to my friend, did not walk like a bear. They sort of almost waddle. They are bears, not humans after all. This, on the other hand, walked just the same as you or I would. Arthur took a quick glance and saw a look of curiosity on the dog's face, not one of anger or hunger, but it was still more than he could take after everything else. He took off, dashing for the front door of the car, sliding in and slamming the door behind him as he watched the manimal run closer. Arthur said he was screaming like a school kid. He got his door locked on the 3rd try. His hands were that shaky. The dogman ran to his car door and began banging on it, which caused Arthur to temporarily freak out in utter fear. By the 3rd time I had heard this retelling, I started kidding him about this part. I made fun of him for not being very brave, and he caught my eyes in a gaze that instantly made me regret I had said that. He asked me how brave I would be when out of nowhere, this thing that looked like some kind of wolf-headed monster man walked out of a lightning storm and came over to your car, banging on it like he was trying to get inside. It's not just the out-of-nowhere realization that you were in very grave mortal danger, but The combination of that with the fact that what was trying to get in and attack you was something that did not and could not possibly exist. You aren't only afraid for your life, you're simultaneously wondering if you've lost your sanity. It's like having all logic and boundaries or definitions removed from your reality. It's the same as staring into eternity before you're ready to understand it. He was like, "So yeah, I screamed. You might have screamed too." And I just shut up, because I could see he was very sensitive about this. I guess I wasn't being very nice. But it was the third time I was hearing the story, so I was trying to interject some levity. People don't want levity when they're trying to tell you a story about how they almost lost their lives and sanity. So Arthur kind of left the building for a while there, figuratively speaking. Instead of starting the car and driving away, he fell into an utter freak-out, screaming and staring at the dog-headed monster through the rain pouring down the outside of his car window. He told me that although the eyes did give off a glow as is reported in other Dogman sightings, it wasn't like they were lit from within. It was just, in his opinion, that the creature was in a highly agitated state and its pupils were extremely dilated, hence more reflective. It had a snout similar to both a dog and a bear, with a dark canine nose at the end. It seemed to be displaying its fangs at Arthur to intimidate him, as though the poor screaming guy wasn't scared enough already. When I pressed him for more details about the dogman's appearance, he told me that the face was dark or black, but the fur grew more lightly colored out toward its cheeks. The face was not as long as a normal dog's. It was taller, as though mixed between a man and a wolf or canine. Its ears had no humanity about them at all. They resembled nothing but dog ears up on top of his head, moving around almost constantly, hearing things no human could ever hear. Arthur told me to imagine an extra-large, feral dog frothing at the mouth, barking and snarling. Then, imagine that dog's head is on top of a body, like an orangutan got crossed with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Imagine it's pounding its clawed fists on your car window. That's pretty much what he claimed that he had seen. I pressed him on that common Dogman question. Were the legs like a dog's legs, or like a human's? He had to stop and think when I asked that, as though it weren't a detail that had really mattered to him at the time. At length, he responded that he had perceived it as a dog at first, and only a dogman after it walked bipedally and after he saw its muscular and human-looking shoulders. He said that it probably had dog legs, otherwise he wouldn't have been surprised to see it walking upright in that way. If the legs had appeared human, then he would have expected to see the creature walking like a man. In other words, he really had no memory at all of what it looked like below the creature's torso, but he assumed it must have a dog-like appearance. I think his quote was, "It was more werewolf than Bigfoot." At this point, the intensity of the dog's eyes took over Arthur's consciousness, and everything got really strange for him for a while. The dogman seemed to be putting suggestions in Arthur's mind, making him feel crazier by the second. He told me honestly he wasn't sure if it was the fear driving him temporarily insane, or if he really was having these suggestions put in his head. The creature seemed to be projecting shame onto him, telling him that he had been trapped, that he had no choice but to come out of his protective metal shell. Arthur said he felt shame in the presence of the great beast and knew that everything he was being told was correct. The hairy dog-headed thing slammed its fist onto the car roof, into various windows, barking and growling to add ferocity and fury to his message. With each bang on the car, Arthur illogically felt more deeply defeated. He was being told in his head that he was in trouble, and each outburst on the part of the Dogman caused him to blush in shame further and to want a bit more to be able to crawl off somewhere and perish. A small part of Arthur's normal waking state was arguing internally that none of this made sense. Other aspects of Arthur's fractured mind agreed to launch an investigation into what was logical or not. This caused a deeper confusion, and Arthur was no longer aware of the meaning of any external stimuli, not even the Dogman banging fiercely on the outside of his automobile. He was probably about to black out when the Dogman began rocking the car back and forth, trying to get Arthur to come out and surrender to him. The movement had roused him from his near slumber, and Arthur began to look around for the source of the disturbance. He could see it, toward the back and the side of the vehicle. It was a hairy man or ape body, and Arthur gasped in shock. Now he could remember. That wasn't an ape. It was a dog. He was beginning to remember again. From the angle he was sitting at, he could see the upper torso and the arms of the Dogman pushing on the car. He could no longer see the animal man's eyes, and he felt that was helping him regain his senses. He was sitting there, yawning, trying to wake up, not completely certain he wasn't still having that one last weird dream before waking up. He told me about the recurring dreams he had. They involved being in his car and finding out that huge roaches were coming up out of the floorboards, crawling up his pant legs. It always sounded like pouring rain, the sound of the roaches pouring up into the car from below. So, at that point, with the Dogman rocking his car, the rain pouring down outside, he still didn't think to start the engine. He was so delirious that he started to look down on himself and the floor of the car, half expecting to see giant water bug-sized cockroaches scrambling around. A loud cracking sound woke Arthur from his reverie, and he saw that there were no nightmare bugs. There was a nightmare storm outside, and there was a nightmare monster behind. The Dogman had swung some hard object into the back windshield and put a big crack in one side of it. That got Arthur's adrenaline flowing, and he finally began the process of turning the key to start the ignition. Over and over and over he tried. That was the main problem with that old car. It would run fine once it started, but it wasn't always going to start when you wanted it to, especially not in the pouring rain. While Arthur tried to start the old Ford, the Dogman bounced over the roof of the car, landing in front and looking back inside. Arthur averted his eyes, still remembering enough to know that the Dogman's eyes had the power to turn his brain to mush and jelly. Finally, one turn of the key resulted in the engine revving to life, and Arthur was finally ready to attempt an escape from this situation. Putting the car in drive, he applied his foot to the pedal and discovered he was unable to move forward. Looking out the windshield, he could see why. The Dogman was so strong that it was able to hold the car back and prevent it from achieving any forward movement or momentum at all. Arthur said it was the most unreal thing you can imagine. The strength of the beast was so far beyond anything that a human being could think of doing without an exoskeleton. Finally able to think clearly, Arthur put the car in reverse and quickly peeled back away from the Dogman, putting a good 50 or 60 feet between them in no time. He sat there with the car in neutral for a few seconds, trying to assess the situation. He still had to manage to get past that monster on a very narrow road. He watched and waited for the creature to break to one side or the other, so he could break the opposite way and attempt to swerve around that thing and make his getaway. The Dogman wouldn't move from the center of the road, though. Its eyes bore into him, and he began to become overwhelmed by a terrible sense of sadness and desperation. He was about to fail once again, wasn't he? He was about to fail because... Arthur realized he had been looking in the Dogman's eyes again. He would begin to feel terrible when he did that. He would begin to doubt and even dislike himself when his eyes met those of the Dogman. Closing his eyes, Arthur did what he told me was the single craziest thing he had ever done. With his eyes shut and completely blind, Arthur hit the gas pedal and held it down as hard as he could. In his mind, he saw the Dogman in front, and he saw himself speeding toward it at an ever-increasing rate of speed. And then, at the last second, he saw that Dogman dive out of the way to save itself. At that point, Arthur opened his eyes and began steering the car to avoid flying off the road. He needed to slow down to regain full control of the vehicle, and when he did that, he could see the Dogman, off in the distance, running after him. Still, even after all that, it kept coming after him. Arthur kept driving, keeping as close to the speed limit as he could, and he knew, somewhere back there, the Dogman was still running after him. He sensed strongly that it wasn't finished yet, although he didn't know if that even made sense. By the time Arthur reached his family, he was clearly ill, sneezing, and muttering crazy stuff about a werewolf that tried to brainwash him that was going to be arriving later that night. They told him later that he was advising them to never look a werewolf in the eyes, and never let one in the house. So, that year, Arthur's family was relatively nice to him. He had discovered the secret of getting them to lay off, arrive with a very high fever, ranting deliriously all weekend. Works like a charm, apparently. Don't try this at home. So, no matter if you have to deal with a large family this weekend, or if you're spending Thanksgiving alone, please, for your own sake, try to find something that's going on in your life that you can be thankful for. No matter how bad you may think you've got it, there's always someone who has it worse than you do. It'll do you good to allow yourself to feel grateful, and you'll discover that a little gratitude may frighten away evil, demonic, vampiric beings, like the Thanksgiving Dogman. Well, what did you think of that one, Debbie?
Spookery.
Thank you.
Up next, my scary Dogman Christmas story, read by P.Q. Ribber, right after this.
And now, get ready for an all-new, completely uncensored, slightly bloody, and absolutely terrifying new Dogman story. Oh, wait. YouTube won't allow me to tell you stories like that on this channel. If you want to hear that, you're going to have to go to peterbernard.com and sign up for our paid subscribers club. You can choose any price you can afford for a 1-month subscription, and then every weekend, we tell you a story YouTube would never allow us to tell you on this channel. See you this Sunday for an all-new, very scary, completely uncensored Dogman story.
The Christmas of Dogman. Submitted by an anonymous viewer. Adapted by Peter Bernard. Read by PQ River. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have to tell you about a cabin I rented for wintertime in Pennsylvania that had at least one Dogman living in the nearby vicinity. I'm 82 now, and this happened back 12 years ago when I was 70 in the year 2007. I wish that I could go back there each winter, but it's really too cold for me, and I would only want to be there alone. Since I wouldn't be able to keep my trip a secret from my daughter and her family, I wouldn't be able to go there by myself. Being alone with the Dogman was the most fascinating time of my life. I'm going to tell you all about those few short days when I lived near a habituated local dogman, and then I'm going to tell you about what the Dogman did after my family came out to stay with me. When I first arrived, I have to admit, I was not really in a wilderness state of mind. I spent long hours flipping TV channels and being bored as I would have been at home. Then I saw something go flitting through the snow from my right to my left. I saw it run past one window, then another. It was a dark animal figure moving as fast as a gazelle, but an alarm went off in my head because, at least in my peripheral vision, it appeared to be running upright, like a man. If there were humans in the area, I would hope they would ring the doorbell and be neighborly, not run past like they were part of a SWAT team. I went on full alert and began circling around inside the cabin, watching outside in all directions, yet seeing nothing else out of the ordinary. I spent the next day exploring the location, which was heavily wooded and covered in a blanket of thick, white snow. I did find prints in the area where I had seen something run. Whatever it was, it had feet much smaller than mine. Of that I could be certain. The snow was so deep and melty that it was hard to tell anything else, at least for a non-expert like me. I couldn't tell from the tracks if this thing had run bipedally or on all fours, but I bet an expert could have figured it out. I figured it must have been a deer or a dog and that I had only imagined it running like a man. Nevertheless, my interest had been piqued, and I began spending my nights on watch, looking out into the darkness for anything moving around in the snow. I saw it again 2 more times. It was always around the same distance from the cabin, too far away to make out clearly, and yet too close for comfort. I thought it was the same animal, but it occurred to me it could also be a family or small clan of them. I wasn't seeing them well enough to really know what they were. Sometimes people ask me why I didn't take pictures of them, but it was very dark and I could barely even see the things with my eyes. I wasn't sure it had taken notice of me yet, and I didn't really want to draw attention to myself if I didn't have to. It was probably just hunting in the area, so it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for me to get to witness whatever this strange being was. In my mind, it could only be one thing: the Pennsylvania Dogman. A kind of creature that resembles a werewolf or a dog-headed Bigfoot. Although legends and reports of the creature go back a ways into history, they don't officially exist as far as science and wildlife authorities are concerned. Sometimes people ask me if I believed in Dogman before I saw one. I don't believe in anything. I'm an agnostic. I'm careful to not always even believe my eyes. I look at the world, I take in what data I can gather, and then I wonder. Nevertheless, in this case, I was pretty sure what I had was a habituated dogman. However, since I knew nothing about the behavior of this creature, and since it's not even supposed to actually exist, I would say that not only can I not be sure of what it was or how many I saw, but in all likelihood, nobody on the planet would be able to accurately make an educated guess in that direction. Back when I was still a youthful 70, I had my own freedom. I was up in that cabin a full week before my daughter and her idiot husband were able to track me down. That was the moment I regretted not turning the landline off. I had seen them calling and texting my cell phone, but that was easy to ignore. They somehow got the number to the cabin, and I innocently picked up, thinking it was from a friend of mine, someone I had given the number to myself. After explaining to them that I was fine and I was just on a vacation in the country, they got jealous and began inviting themselves out for Christmas Eve. I explained again that I was on a vacation alone. They asked me for directions. I said I was taking a break from humanity, and then one of my grandkids shouted that they got the GPS coordinates of my cabin from the guy who rented me the place. I began to resign myself to the idea of them all visiting, but then a flash of fear shot through me. What about the Dogman? I may not think much of my son-in-law, but I love my daughter, and her kids are just as dear to me. I didn't want them placing themselves in danger just because they thought I might be having more fun than they were having. "There are bears here," I said over the phone. "Ooh, bears," gushed my moronic in-law, adding, "Kids, Grandpa says there are bears out there." They all cheered. I rolled my eyes. "I didn't say there was a zoo here with bears in it. I was telling you that there are feral, wild bears here." The dummy didn't seem to understand the difference. I told him it was too dangerous and that if he brought my family into a life-threatening situation, I was going to tie him to a tree and leave him for the omnivores. I would have said carnivores, but I'm not sure he's entirely made of meat. He just chuckled. "Oh, Grandpa, you and your sense of humor again." He really didn't understand how little respect I had for him, which was probably just as well. Ignorance is bliss. Therefore, he's the most blissful of all. And so, my family arrived in the early afternoon on Christmas Eve, and I plastered on a smile for the sake of the kids. They were cool, and it wasn't their fault who they were born to. It was nice to see my daughter again as well, and I made us all a big lunch. They had brought movies with them that I couldn't get my DVD player to play. The kids hooked one of their devices to my TV and ran some other kind of movie some other way. I don't really remember any of the details. The main thing was they seemed happy, and as long as they were staring at the boob tube, they weren't bothering me about useless nonsense. I showed them my hoard of various brands of microwave popcorn and let them have at it. Why they needed to come out to the country to do the same thing they would have done at home, I will never know, but I hoped they were out of my hair for a while, and I took up a position by my bedroom window to watch for the Dogman. I was intensely curious about the thing after what had already gone down. I'm not going to act like I wasn't scared of it, but so far it hadn't made any effort to break in, so as long as I stayed inside, I had no evidence that it would be dangerous toward me in any way. It was a quiet night, other than the endless racket blasting off the TV, and there was nothing happening outside my window. I realized I was dozing off when a scream from my granddaughter shot me directly to attention. I was out of my bedroom in a flash, scanned the TV room to see she was not there, and feared the worst. That she had gone outside, in the dark, alone. "Where's my granddaughter?" I demanded of the zombies prostrated before their glowing rectangular god. She screamed again, and I could tell it was from my left, from the bathroom. Before I'd taken 2 steps in that direction, she ran out screaming and crying directly into my arms. Now the parents began panicking and shrieking, which is the stupidest thing to do when a kid is upset. I told them calmly to shut up, then asked my granddaughter what happened. I was looking over her shoulder toward the bathroom when she whispered in my ear. She had left the light on when she ran out, and everything looked normal in there as far as I could see from my point of view. What she whispered in my ear was the word monster, and some other things which I couldn't hear because the childish parents were selfishly talking over each other. They reminded me of dogs, all barking because some other dog somewhere had barked. They weren't even looking at each other. They were just pontificating and competing for the volume. I asked them again to please be quiet, and they both started lecturing me even more loudly. They were going to be a problem, possibly for all of us. I needed them to calm down, and most of all, I needed everyone to stay inside. The children were smart enough to listen to me, but the adults were so stupid. They thought their emotions and ego were more important than their own safety or the safety of their offspring. They were incapable of existing in a moment without loudly casting a condescending judgment on it. It seemed they would literally rather perish than shut up for even a second. I blame myself for this. I raised my child wrong. None of the values I taught her had survived her going to an Ivy League university. She had been trained by me to be a human being, a genuine human being, present in the moment and treating others as she would want them to treat her. After 8 or 9 years of undergraduate and postgraduate studies, she was a worker of an industry whose solution to every problem was to freak out and make demands of her employer to take care of her better. She was little more than a pet. She would preen and bask in her self-importance, being the star of the show for years, and then she would have no say when management sent her to the vet to have her put to sleep. She had no instinct left for independence or independent thought. She really wasn't American anymore, at least not in any traditional sense of ingenuity and self-reliance. But she was my kin, and I loved her anyways. It's not our place to judge. It's only our job to love. However, my daughter made it hard to love when she would start gibberishing out long, unnecessary emotionalisms during a crisis when every moment counted. Not only would she and her husband refuse to accept my authority and superior knowledge and experience in crises, they would deliberately thwart my efforts to get things under control. I needed to get the girl away from them into a quiet area, but I knew she wouldn't want to go back to that bathroom. I decided to use child psychology on the adults. "Oh my God, will you look at that?" I shouted at the top of my lungs as I feigned shock and stared into my bedroom, pointing in there. Of course, the two parents ran in there and I slammed the door behind them, locking it. Now, my grandson and I could find out what actually happened to the girl. It was a monster, she told us both. A monster looking in the window at me. I ran into the bathroom and of course nothing was around any longer. The parents were now making as much noise banging on my door to get out as they had been before I locked them in there, but they were easier to block out this way. The girl described what she saw as a very bad dog and a naughty dog that got turned into a monster for being so bad. Her brother thought she was making it up, but I had reason to believe her. Hell, I had a few reasons to believe her. I had to let the parents out, but I waited till the girl had calmed down a bit. I asked her if she wanted to go home, and she said yes. I said I was going to let her parents out of my room, and I wanted her to tell them what she had told me. I did as I said I would do, and she tried valiantly to tell them what had happened, but it became apparent that they really didn't care. It wasn't about them, after all. They just wanted to act indignant and express their own narrative about how I had locked them in the room. I told them it was an accident. They started throwing a fit that I didn't attend to their needs soon enough. I asked them if I should have abandoned a crying girl to help them, and I asked them why they felt they were more helpless than a little kid. I asked them how old they were, and they ignored all of this. I told them that their girl saw a monster. She told them that she saw a monster. Her brother said she's just lying for attention, and both parents agreed with him and started lecturing me that kids make things up. I really enjoyed when they would act like I knew nothing about child rearing and that they were the experts. "Your daughter wants to go home," I told them, and she jumped up and down clinging to me saying, "Grandpa's right." So then I got the condescending lecture about how they weren't going to cancel the family vacation plans because one of the kids was playing a game of make-believe. By this point, it was the children's bedtime anyway, so they jumped in the bunk beds in the guest room and the parents had to sleep in their sleeping bags on the floor, complaining the entire time that they deserved better accommodations. Shaking my head and biting my tongue, I chose a window to sit by and decided to watch for the Dogman for a while. It was Christmas Eve. In the morning, the family would exchange presents that they could have exchanged at home, and maybe, with luck, I could get them to leave before nightfall. I dozed off trying to think of ways to convince them that they should go home, while also convincing them that it was their own idea to leave. I was awakened by being shaken awake. It was my son-in-law with a goofy grin on his face.
"The kids are asleep,"
he informed me. "So am I told him. He chuckled his dumb guy laugh and then told me to wake up because he had the most fun thing ever and he needed my help with it. I knew he really meant the lamest thing ever, but I asked him to explain. He showed me a folded-up Santa costume complete with these incredibly cheap and slippery-looking Santa boots. "Alls you have to do," he told me, "is put on this costume and get up on the roof, climb down the chimney, and then give the kids a present or two." "What do I do then?" I asked. "Climb back up the chimney and fly away?" He hadn't thought about how I would make my exit. He said, "Let's just improvise." "I'm not going to do that, you idiot," I answered him. "But Dad," he pleaded, "you have the gray beard. You're the perfect Santa." "Maybe I could play Santa at Macy's," I told him. "But that doesn't mean I suddenly have the ability to climb up on a roof in those vinyl Santa costume boots and climb down my own chimney." I asked him if he understood the difference between movies and real life, and he looked confused. That answered my question. I explained that they build special sets for Santa Claus in the movies, while what he was asking me to do was climb down an actual, filthy, old chimney that I could get stuck in and die. He told me I was very fit for a 70-year-old, so I would be able to pull it off, no problem. The reason that I'm still fit for a 70-year-old, I told him, is because I don't put on slippery vinyl boots and walk on angled roofs while it's snowing. Eventually, the dimwit decided that he'd play Santa himself, and my own daughter endorsed this idea. I'm not even going to tell you how much I spent on her education only for her to end up marrying this bad Santa impersonator. I had such high hopes for her, but at least she is responsible for co-creating the two best grandkids ever. Once he had the costume on and was ready to begin his idiotic attempt to scale the wall of the cabin, I took pity on him. "Look," I said, "you don't want to go out there. It's not safe out there at night. Just stand in front of the fireplace and your wife and I will wake the kids up and tell them you just came down the chimney, okay?" He was so intent on proving me wrong that he went outside anyway, looking for a part of the house that might be easier to climb. I don't even think it was even a minute later when that dimwit came racing back in the house screaming like he was on fire. The kids were awakened right away and came out to see what the noise was all about. What they saw probably cost my daughter a bundle on therapy for a few years. Their father was standing there, mostly still in the Santa suit. The thing is, the back of his pants were missing, exposing the back of his boxer shorts. Both kids were pointing and laughing, and I was having a hard time holding it in myself. "How'd you manage to lose the back of your pants, Santa?" I asked, and that young man just looked at me, speechless. It didn't seem so funny to me any longer, and I asked him directly. "It was the wolf, wasn't it? You got chased by the Dogman, and he bit off the back of your pants like it was a scene from a Three Stooges movie. Am I guessing right?" My question was answered as the creature slammed its face up against the window closest to where we were standing. Every one of us screamed at the hideous features of the Dogman. smeared and distorted up against the glass with the wildest expression I've ever seen in the eyes of any dog. I'd never seen it so close before, but this must have been what scared my granddaughter earlier. It was only there a few seconds and then it ran off, but we were all, myself included, completely terrified for the rest of the night. I told everyone we should stay together, and as long as we were inside all night, we should be totally fine. Internally, I prayed that I was telling them the truth. I hung a big blanket over the bathroom window so that nothing could look in at us, but the kids demanded bodyguards as well before brushing their teeth. We all huddled together under blankets on mattresses we tossed on the floor inside my bedroom. It was the only room that had a lock on the door, and I hoped it would be the safest place to stay. If that dogman decided to break through my window, though, better not to finish that thought. Needless to say, once the sun rose, we packed Christmas up and brought it back to the suburbs where it belonged. The kids had a great day, my son-in-law bought us a nice dinner, and then I made my way back up to the cabin to spend more time with Dogman before my own vacation time was up. I never saw him again, but I could feel his presence in the area, so I don't think he left. Maybe he just wasn't as interested in me as he was in my family. I don't know. It's possible he just viewed me as too old and gristly to want to eat for dinner, you know? And so, that is how I spent the Christmas of 2007, or, as my family refers to it, the Christmas of Dogman. Well, was I right, or was I right? That was the best story, wasn't
It
it?
was pretty scary, all right.
I hope each of you have the scariest, most terrifying and frightening Christmas ever.
Ah, that's sweet.
I hope Krampus punishes you and your family just as much as you deserve.
What?
Of course, I'm only joking.
Yeah, right. Joking.
Merry holidays, whichever ones you celebrate, and let's all keep our fingers crossed that we'll meet again in the new year.
Here, here. Oh, wait, I don't actually have fingers.
Happy holidays and Merry New Year from Dr. Death, PQ Ribber, and everybody at Scary Stories NYC.
Scary Christmas, everybody.
Good night.
If you enjoyed this, please click like or consider subscribing. Remember to click the bell icon or you won't get notifications. If you want to listen to Bigfoot's secret uncensored story each Sunday, just go to peterbernard.com and become a paid subscriber. See you tomorrow. Same dog time, same dog channel.